Ever since Game of Thrones happened, writers have been looking for new ways to subvert audience expectations. And this is with good reason, because Game of Thrones was great, at least until it wasn't. And part of what made the early seasons of the show so powerful was that our expectations were being subverted again and again. If you thought the good guys were going to triumph in season 1, you'd be wrong. If you thought the good guys would get revenge in season 3, you'd be wrong. If you thought that it would take an epic battle to defeat an evil ruler, you'd be wrong. And this was the fun of the show, and it's something that trickled into a lot of popular stories in recent years. And today I want to take a look at the Netflix series Squid Game, which I think does a phenomenal job of subverting expectations in one of its early episodes. Consider this your spoiler warning. I'm going to be talking about Squid Game. We're going to focus on episode 2, so if you haven't seen the show yet, you might want to back out of this video, go watch it, and then come back. By the way, I'm Brandon McNulty. I'm the author of Bad Parts. I'm also the author of Entry Wounds, and welcome to my writing channel. Now, when we talk about subverting expectations, the way that you do this is you take something familiar, usually like a story trope, like maybe the wise old mentor character in a fantasy story, or a haunted house in a horror story, and you make that familiar trope fresh again. Give the audience something they don't expect. Not necessarily the total opposite, but something they don't expect. If you're expecting the wise old mentor to be patient and compassionate, maybe he's a mess, maybe he's a total drunk. If you're expecting the haunted house to be full of ghosts, maybe it's actually the safest place in town, maybe the ghosts avoid it. There are a lot of ways to subvert expectations. Those are just some basic examples. But the point is that you want to take something familiar and make it fresh again by giving the audience something they don't expect. Now, a great example of a recent movie that did this is Avengers Endgame. Now, Avengers Endgame, of course, follows Infinity War, and Infinity War ends with Thanos getting what he wants. He wants to snap his fingers and make half of all life in the universe disappear. And of course, this happens. Now, after Infinity War was over, a lot of us had expectations for Endgame. We all thought that, okay, well, maybe the remaining Avengers are going to go on this epic quest to track down Thanos and take him out and force him to bring back half of the universe. But what actually happened is that Thanos is killed off in the first 15 minutes of the movie. I don't know about you, but when I went to the theater on opening night, I did not expect that. That was a total subversion of my expectations. Instead of getting this epic quest story, we got a time travel story. And we got to see characters in a new scenario. We got to see them interacting with their former selves, and we got to see a rematch with Thanos at the end. A lot of interesting things happened because our expectations were subverted right at the start of the movie. Now, I think it's important to distinguish between good subversion and bad subversion. Good subversion, like in the Endgame example, is subversion that is meaningful. It gives the story and characters more depth. It explores unfamiliar scenarios, and it keeps the audience on their toes. It lets them know that anything is on the table. If Thanos can get killed off in the first 15 minutes, who knows what else can go on in this movie? Now, on the other hand, bad subversion is subversion that exists purely for shock value, or to simply be different. A lot of writers nowadays feel pressured to subvert expectations, and because of this, they try to force twists into their story, even when those twists don't really pay off in a meaningful way. If you are subverting your audience's expectations, you need to remember that the audience still needs to be satisfied by these twists. You need to make them meaningful, and you need to give the story and the characters more depth as a result of these subversions. Now, as I mentioned, Squid Game does a great job of taking a familiar trope and making it fresh again, and it does this in its second episode. But let me just give you a quick recap of the first episode just so we're all on the same page. Now, in this first episode, we're introduced to our main character. We see that he lives with his mother, he works as a chauffeur, and he has a gambling problem, and this gambling problem is just tearing his life apart. He can't see his daughter because she now lives with her mother as well as her stepfather, and this guy, our main character, he can't even give his daughter a proper birthday gift because of his gambling addiction. So he's got a lot of problems in his life, and he needs this to change. And when he gets an opportunity to play a simple game in order to win money, he of course takes it, and he wins some money. And then he gets the opportunity to play an even bigger game with a larger prize, and this is where he gets invited into the main game of the series. And once he arrives at the game facility, he sees that he's involved in a twisted game with life and death stakes. And it's a lot of fun to watch. The second half of this episode was an absolute blast. And at the end of it, it was pretty clear to me that this was the type of story like Battle Royale or The Hunger Games or Saw, or even like video games like Zero Escape and Danganronpa, where you have characters trapped in some kind of unknown facility and they're forced to kill each other, or they're forced to compete in a series of wacky and wild games in order to win money or in order to prove some kind of point or whatever it may be. Usually in these types of stories, once the people enter the game facility, they're they're stuck there until the very end. So naturally, at the end of the first episode, I expected that, okay, episode 2 is going to be game number 2. We just saw game number 1, and we saw that it was that red light, green light thing. Now I wonder what game number 2 is. But episode 2 is where the writers subvert our expectations. At the beginning of this episode, the players have the option to end the game by a majority vote. And while I was watching this episode, I thought this scene existed purely to show us which characters are really desperate and which ones value their lives more than the money. I did not expect the scene to play out the way it did. And of course, the characters are voting back and forth, yes and no, and it comes down to the final vote, and the old man votes, and when he votes, this happens. And that's it. The games are over. Everybody can go home. No, seriously, everybody can go home, and they do go home. And this, to me, was just a mind blow. I never expected this to happen in a million years because, again, this genre of stories, usually once the characters arrive at the gaming facility, they do not leave until the very end if they're lucky. But in episode 2 of Squid Game, the writers subvert our expectations, and they subvert them in a meaningful way, and it's meaningful for 5 reasons. The first reason is because once we get them out of the facility, we are able to get more invested in the side characters. I don't know about you, but in the first episode, the only real character I felt an attachment to was our main character. We got to see him with his daughter. We got to see him as a flawed guy who is gambling away his money. He's really suffering because of it, but we didn't really get to see a lot of the side characters. However, in the second episode, we get to see the side characters in action. We get to see what their lives look like, and we get to spend time with them as people rather than as players. We also get to see how they react to that first game, how they react after they go back out into the world. One guy tells the police about it, another guy wants to get back in there, and other characters respond in different ways. It's really interesting, and it tells us a lot about the main character as well as our side characters. Second reason why the subversion is meaningful is because it conveys character backstory without flashbacks, and I love this. If you watch this channel, you know that I hate flashbacks more than anything. I think that they just disrupt the flow of a story, they take us out of the present, and they just jumble everything up. Typically, in these types of stories where you're trapped in the gaming facility and you can't go out into the outside world again, you have to convey character in one way or another, and usually the only options are that you have your different characters talking with one another about their past, or you show us some flashbacks to show us where they came from, and so on and so on. But in Squid Game, the writers keep us in the present. They show us these characters in their daily lives, who they are as people, who matters to them, what they want in life, and we get to see it all in the present without any flashbacks. Third reason why the subversion works so well is because it shows the characters as flawed and desperate people, especially desperate. And what the second episode did so well with this, it took the characters out of the life and death situation, it put them back in their normal world, and they had this option of just going back to their normal lives and trying to be better people. Instead, we see how desperate these characters are for money for various reasons, and they're so desperate that they are willing to go back to this life and death game that horrified them in the previous episode. Fourth reason why this subversion works so well is because it allows the writers to introduce a brand new detective character into the story and to introduce him in a way that is natural. It's natural because he's doing some detective work. He's trying to track down this gaming facility, and he has a personal stake in it because his brother has disappeared. He wants to know what happened to his brother, where did he go? And in order to figure this out, he has to track down the main character and ask some questions. And then finally, my fifth reason for why the subversion works so well is because it prevents the story concept from getting stale. The games are awesome, and after the first episode, I was really excited for the next game. I thought that each episode would be a new game. First episode would be game 1, second episode would be game 2, and so on and so on. But when the writers threw me the curveball where it was like, okay, well, actually, we're getting out of the games for a second, that helped preserve the mystery of the games. That helped preserve the excitement. And instead of getting the law of diminishing returns where you give the audience the same thing over and over and over again until they get bored with it, we get a totally different path, and it helps keep things interesting in the long run. But the key takeaway is this: meaningful subversion is equal to surprise plus depth. It's not enough to just shock the audience. You also have to give us some depth to it. You have to tell us more about the story and more about the characters. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: what is your favorite example of a recent story that subverts expectations? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of either one of my novels. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, hit the like and subscribe buttons for me, share this video with a friend, and as always, remember to keep on writing.